Welcome to today's webinar, Stop Chasing SMEs, Build Better Collaboration and Better Docs. I'm Sheba and I'll be a host for today's session. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Annie Zempel, Vice President of Technical Communications at Greylock. Today, she'll share practical strategies for transforming SME collaboration from reactive information gathering to structured, trust-based partnerships that improve documentation quality, streamline workflows, and reduce bottlenecks. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure to address them towards the end of the session. With that, I'll hand it over to Annie. The stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. So as you heard, I'm Annie Zempel. I'm the Vice President of Technical Communications at Greylock, which is a log management and security analytics platform. Thank you all for joining today. I hope we have a wonderful session. Just to know a little bit more about me, I lead a team of technical writers and content creators, and we build documentation and learning experiences for security practitioners. I've spent about 15 years in the technical communications space, running knowledge bases and building content teams and all the like. I got my start as a technical writer working for the Department of Defense, and I've had the privilege of working with both ops and development teams in my career to create end user technical documentation. Today, I want to start by talking about a single SME interaction, a subject matter expert interaction that I had way earlier in my career that I got completely wrong. And I think it's a situation that a lot of us as writers have found ourselves in to varying degrees. So I'm early in my career, brand new technical writer. I'm working on one of my first big projects, which is to document some API calls. I'm partnered with one subject matter expert, one SME, to get this done. We have several working sessions. We go through our process of what I felt was collaboration. We wrap up the work, and then afterward, this SME goes to their leadership and tells them that I was great to work with. And in their words, I was easier than the technical writers that they had worked with previous. And obviously, this is feedback that gets funneled my way via my leadership. When I first got the word about this feedback, I admit I was thrilled, right? This is the kind of feedback that you want when you're 3 months into a job. You want to hear that the people that you work with want to work with you. But I thought about it for some time, and I realized that the feedback that I had received wasn't actually measuring how good I was at my job. It was measuring something else, and that something else was not great. The truth about this project is that it went wildly past its deadline. Getting time with this SME was tough. We had canceled meetings. There were questions that went into a void or got miscommunicated. There were requests that I had to send 2 and 3 times. And every time that they pushed the timeline on me or changed direction, I absorbed it. I accommodated this SME again and again and again. And I realized that accommodation to the SME is what easy to work with meant. It didn't mean that the collaboration was good. It meant that I never pushed back or course corrected when I should have done so. I had made the whole project frictionless by quietly taking all of the friction of the project onto myself. And at the end of the day, my deliverable was late, I was exhausted, and I didn't have a working relationship with that SME to show for it. I had basically trained this person to treat me as someone that would just absorb what information they gave me when they got around to giving me that information. Easy to work with wasn't a compliment. It was a diagnosis, and not a good one. Now, I want to be clear. The lesson that I took from that is not, I need to be harder to work with, right? That's not going to serve us well. The lesson was that I had confused 2 things. I had thought that being accommodating was the same thing as being collaborative, and it's not. A good working relationship is not going to be measured simply by how comfortable it is. It's measured by whether or not 2 people can do good work together on time. And sometimes all of those things are going to pull you in opposite directions. And this is the reason why I lead with that story. It's one story, but I don't think it's unusual. I actually think it happens for technical writers and SMEs relatively frequently. When I've told this story before to other writers, I get nods of affirmation, I get variations of the same story. It's that SME that goes dark, or that gives a half answer, that creates two new questions. It's the documentation that ships late, or that still has gaps or issues. And when it happens, and I think we should be kind of honest with ourselves here, when things like that happen, I think our tendency as writers sometimes is to tell ourselves a story that it's about the SME, right? The SME is busy, they're unresponsive, they don't care about documentation. And I want to push on that just a little bit, because I think if the problem reiteratively were simply that SMEs are unresponsive, we would never, as writers, have the opportunity to be effective. We would never get the work done in the way that we need to. And that's not the case. The case is that sometimes we build structures or we facilitate processes with SMEs that don't allow them to collaborate effectively with us. And that's the wrong way to build those structures. So what does that wrong structure sometimes look like? So I think for a lot of us, working with SMEs runs on a loop. I, as the writer, need information. I ping the SME. I wait. I get an answer or part of an answer. I ping again. I get more information. I wait again. Eventually, at some point, I have enough information to build a draft from. And then, and this is where I think the honesty kind of comes in on our part, my tendency in that loop is to vanish. I disappear from that SME until the next task, until the next need. And then I have to cold start that entire interaction from scratch. And that loop is the problem. It fails for a number of reasons. And those reasons don't really have to do with how generous any individual SME is with their time or their resources. When there's no relationship for the work to sit on top of, every time we ask something of the SME, that ask is going to show up cold to them. And then the input is unstructured. So I maybe ask these big, vague questions, or dump the responsibility of the information gathering or even the work of the drafting onto the busiest person in the chain in this interaction. And when that happens, every doc sort of feels, I think, to the SME like an emergency. And it's only an emergency because I'm chasing it down. So let's talk about how we kind of shift this structure. If any of this stuff is resonating with you, I'm going to recommend 3 ways that you can shift into a more structured and collaborative process with the SMEs that you work with. The first one is going to be a shift from extraction to partnership, from unstructured input, moving into unstructured input into guided contribution, and then finally going from bottlenecks to flow. These are the 3 shifts that I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about today. So let's start with the relationship itself. If we go back to my initial example of creating this API documentation, I think it was worth me ultimately asking, what was I doing in that relationship and working with that SME? Truthfully, I was showing up when I needed something. I took the information that I could get when I could get it, and then I left until I needed something again. And because that was the way I was building that relationship, every single interaction with that SME felt like a withdrawal, right? I was taking from them, but I was never giving anything back. And when that happened, I found myself genuinely surprised that the SME wasn't invested, wasn't prioritizing my needs or my asks, didn't treat my deadline as real, and wasn't racing around to help me in creating the documentation that I had been tasked with creating. But of course they weren't. I wasn't giving them a reason to be invested. I think a lot of writer and SME relationships feel transactional. And that's what I mean when I say a withdrawal, right? We task the SME to give us information. We send them the request. We ask for the review. We need it done by Thursday or what have you. And from the SME side, work just keeps landing on them with no context and nothing coming back to them. It feels like a withdrawal. They don't know why this documentation matters. They don't know who it's for or what happens if it's late. It's one more thing in their inbox that's coming from someone who's in a different part of the organization and part that maybe they have no other excellent relationship with outside of working with individual technical writers. And if that's all we're handing them, if we're withdrawing from them and making that interaction transactional, then they're on their part checking out from that interaction is kind of a rational response because nobody pours effort into a void. And if documentation work feels, or knowledge capture work feels like pouring effort into a void, then SMEs are going to treat it like one. So that shift to partnership is, it's not really about what I had thought it was about beginning and early in my career. It wasn't about asking nicely. It wasn't about being personable. It wasn't about being accommodating, right? It's about giving the SME a stake in the deliverable, a stake in the ask and in the work. And you do that by connecting that deliverable and that work to something real and something tangible. Now, I kind of want to caveat this part of the talk by acknowledging what I feel like is an underlying assumption to the point that I'm making. I'm assuming a reasonable SME, given real context and given demonstrated impact, is more empowered to treat documentation as a priority. Now, I acknowledge that that is org and culture dependent in some cases, right? All orgs are going to have different cultures, and SMEs are going to feel empowered or disempowered to varying degrees to prioritize work. However, from my experience and the experience of those that I have worked with, I stake a claim here that for the vast majority of SMEs, having a greater stake in the input, or sorry, in the output has a positive effect on the quality of the input that the SME will give you. But, and here's another caveat, and I cannot stress this one enough, you as the writer are not going to be able to hand a SME investment in something if you don't have investment in it yourself. If I am working off of a backlog of tickets, right? If I've been given a task simply because it exists in Jira or Asana or wherever, and I'm approaching the task from the perspective of, I was told to document this. I was told to document this feature. I was told to review this piece of information for lack of clarity. If that's all I can walk into a conversation with a SME with, then all I can do is give them a task. I have no impact to impart on or share with them because I don't know the impact either. So the whole interaction is going to collapse back into being transactional. It has to, right? So before I, as the writer, go anywhere near the SME, I need to be able to answer some fundamental questions. First and foremost, why does this document matter? Why does the documentation work I'm doing in front of me matter? What impact does it have? And secondarily, who's it for? For whom is this documentation intended? Those are crucial questions that I need to be able to ask in that conversation. Now, as a writer, there are a lot of ways for me to investigate the answers to these questions. I can, depending upon the structure of my organization, collaborate with my existing customer or user-facing functions. I can work with support. I can work with professional services. I could even potentially go to product. Whatever areas of your organization do the most impactful user-facing work or customer-facing work, I can ask them investigative questions to get down to why fundamentally the documentation work that I am carrying out has impact. I can ask support, is this document answering a ticket that we get over and over? If I write or supplement this knowledge article, is there a potential that you will see a decrease in the ticket volume you receive on this issue? That's a big one, right? We know that there's a hugely symbiotic relationship between support and documentation. Another question I can ask of those user-centered teams is there a real person asking for this information? Is there a customer? Is there a user? Is there a face I can put to or a name I can put to this ask that can raise the feeling of prioritization? Or even if I'm looking internally in my team, in my docs team, do I have tangible feedback that I can provide to show that there is a need for this information? Does this close a gap I can see in documentation feedback? Whether that feedback is binary, right? You have your thumbs up and thumbs down metrics, that's fine. Or you have open commentary on documentation, you can use that feedback to assess the impact of the potential change. Now, if we look at a through line across all of these examples, we can see that the trend is that they're all built on evidence. Broadly claiming that documentation, good documentation, helps users is background noise. Okay, so getting back to it. So if we look at the through line of the kinds of questions that we're asking here, we can see that it's all based around evidence, right? What is the evidence that I need to bring to the table to demonstrate the impact of this potential documentation? This is something that can give your SME with whom you're working reason to invest. And it transforms from that abstract statement that better documentation translates into more empowered users. It's not that that statement is wrong, it's very much correct, but it's a very abstract statement to make. Rather, you bring to the table the concrete impact that you can have and leverage in that conversation with that SME to gather the information and improve the documentation. Now, these questions do something for you as a writer as well. They can also point you to where additional SMEs or stakeholders live in an organization. One thing I know technical writers tend to struggle with is not just working with SMEs, but finding out who my SME is. With whom do I need to work to resolve the knowledge gap or the ask that I have in front of me? In looking through and investigating more closely the impact of documentation, you can see that support is sitting on top of every recurring problem that you're going to have in docs. And your engineers, by the way, are downstream of that same gap. So when you start bringing and treating documentation as something that you build from ticket data and real user friction, those people who are closest to those friction points, support, services, what have you, they stop being those one-off interviewees that you work with and you only chase down when you need them, and they become those renewable sources of expertise because they are so invested in the outcome. Now, the other reason that this matters is sort of another point in the industry that I'm passionate about, and it's that it can demonstrate your own expertise as a technical writer. You, as the technical writer, can bring to the table, can bring to that conversation the proximity to the end user, to their confusion, to their frustration, to their need. So while the person that you are talking to, the people that you're talking to, are the subject matter experts with deep technical understanding of the mechanism of the process, you can represent the expertise, the knowledge of the audience, the reader, the user, their pain points, their frustrations, right? How they're articulating their own needs. And it's not that you're just providing a courtesy by being the individual who's tasked with creating the document. It's that you offer distinct and essential expertise in condensing and representing that user in the room when you're talking to the SME. You serve as the advocate for the end user when you can articulate the impact of documentation. And that also becomes the difference between partnership and transaction. That's two people together with two different kinds of knowledge, two different kinds of expertise, working together toward a common goal. And if I take that partnership seriously, then I also have to make sure that I'm taking the time seriously of that expert with whom I'm working. And that's where partnership shows up. Managing these relationships as a technical writer is not a nice to have soft skill. It's, to my mind, an interpretation, really the whole thing happening in practice. So I'm preparing very thoroughly before I ever take their time. I'm sending them my questions in advance. I'm not improvising on the spot. I'm, with their permission, I'm recording the session, so they're giving the information one time. I'm not asking the SME to take the heavy lifting of the P1 or 101 level stuff. I've done that research myself. I'm saving their attention for what is deeply embedded in their brain that I need to extract. And the prep work that I do and the tools that I use, that can be a part of the process that already exists in place. But the point is this, that when I'm walking into that room or I'm getting on that Zoom call or what have you, the expensive thing, which is the expertise of the person that I'm speaking with, that is the only thing that I am spending on that call, the expense of their expertise. It's a good thing also to remember that a transaction is just a moment in time, and that transaction does not constitute the whole of a relationship. It's not just about how well you ask the question or get the information in the moment that you need it. It's about being present in that relationship long before the ask, right? Maintaining that connection with SMEs between projects, circling back to when the work is done, showing them this is key too. If you're articulating to a SME the impact of documentation to get them invested, when you can close that loop with them by going back to the SME and showing them, hey, look, here's how we affected change, right? Here's how the tickets dropped because we published a knowledge article closing this gap, or here's how that binary feedback has shifted into the positive because you worked with me to create this knowledge artifact. That is a wonderful relationship building technique as well. Okay, so knowing why documentation matters, that gets that conversation moving in the right direction. But how you continue that conversation and seek information from the SME is also a crucial skill, right? I like to think about the questions that I ask SMEs, and the ones that first come up into my brain typically, especially earlier in my career, tended toward the vague, right? I think many of us have had some iteration of this question. Hey, SME, can you explain how this works? Or, hey, can you review this doc? Or, hey, tell me about this new feature. On the surface, these seem like the obvious questions and maybe even a starting point. But if you consider the reality of asking open-ended and vague questions, you might also consider that what you're in effect doing is taking the blank page in front of you and handing it to your expert, right? You're, in a way, asking them to identify your requirements, filter and organize information, and structure the narrative of the deliverable end to end, all while they're managing another job, right? And again, when we think about the expense of an expert, that is a really expensive request because it's the heavy lifting of the documentation work going on the most overtaxed person who's participating in this process. What happens when we do that to SMEs? They stall, they disappear, they either don't participate at all, or they give us so much information that's shapeless and enormous and not what I'm looking for, so that I have to go back and decode that information. Either way, that momentum is dead, right? The momentum we've gained in that relationship is gone. In my example, my starting example for API documentation, that was certainly at least half of my problem. I was asking vague, open-ended questions and wondering why information was taking so long to source, because every single question I was asking was far too expensive to answer. We cannot ask our SMEs to tackle the blank page problem. We work more effectively by giving them information to react to or asking pointed questions. Frame it this way. Your job as a technical writer is to make a good answer from a SME as cheap as possible, not expensive. This can work because reacting to a draft, and as writers, we know the monumental task of the blank page, right? When you send a huge open-ended question, that momentum is dropping, but a sharp and pointed question, looking at information that exists, right? That keeps the energy of the conversation alive. You can do the heavy lifting of the organization. You can synthesize the information appropriately and let the deliverable take shape in the way that you want, and give the SME the job of reacting to information or supplementing information rather than gathering from nothing. So let's kind of make that a bit more concrete. We can look at some vague versions of questions we may ask. On the vague side, we may say, hey, can you explain how this authentication protocol works? Or the one that always kind of feels like nails on a chalkboard to me, which is, hey, SME, can you review this doc? Or tell me about this new feature. These are not pointed asks. These are vague. These are not task-oriented. These are daunting. These are blank page problems. If we consider slightly more guided versions, rather than can you explain how this authentication works, we might say, hey, look, I took a stab from what I know and what I've researched at sketching out this flow. Can you tell me where I got this wrong, right? Or can you point me in the right direction? Rather than can you review this doc, which is so open-ended, it doesn't give me something to respond to. You might ask, hey, I have 2 questions for you. Is this the right rate limit? Or does this error match what you are seeing, right? More pointed, more specific. A vague version, tell me about this new feature, something more guided. Especially if you're asking a SME that has more experience on the user side, what do people get wrong from the way the product is now or the process is now? For SMEs who are not so much on the user side, it may be something more like, what about the product or process has changed? And can you show me how? Guiding that SME toward that demo also can remove the bird with the blank page. The vague one is nothing to build on. It's a non-starter, right? The guided one hands them information that they can build upon, and it gets me, the writer, something that I can actually use. Now, I want to talk briefly about drafts, and this is the point in the conversation where I want to address the elephant in the room, and that elephant for all of us right now is AI. The landscape of how we generate drafts has shifted. We all know this, right? And not only do we need to find new ways to deal with our own tasks and processes internally as writers because of this shift, we need to address how that changes our working relationships with SMEs and our partnership building. AI has made it, I'm going to say easier, but different when it comes to draft generation. There is a temptation that we will all have as writers to grab drafts or grab content that is AI generated and pass the work of revision and review onto the SME. That is its impulse we all have got to check, right? That's actually the blank page problem again in new close. You're not reducing the cognitive load on the SME by handing them content that is AI generated without your revision, right? Without your authoring, right? And in effect, you're actually increasing their cognitive load by giving them AI content that is not heavily reviewed. It kind of makes them the cleanup crew for AI generated content, and they know that, and they will sense that, and that will damage the relationships that you build with SMEs, because they will feel as if you are passing on to them the burden of the work. You're also, in a way, if you go down this path, writers in a way are training SMEs that helping with documentation is tedious cleanup, not pointed information sharing. And that's the wrong message we want to send. If we invest in the idea of the technical writer, we have to invest in the idea that human review and revision and drafting is non-negotiable. Our accuracy demands it, our quality demands it, and our users certainly deserve it. Review of documentation, we know, can be painful, especially for the SME. And you control, as the writer, how painful that review is. So doing that legwork first, doing the review and revision first, takes away some of that pain. You are marking for clarity, revising for accuracy, you're noting in the documentation the places that you want that heavy technical review, and you're guiding your SME through the process of review step by step. Again, remember this, you are lowering the cost of getting a good answer from an expensive resource. And I don't, by the way, mean expense in terms of actual dollars. I just mean expense in the terms of their time and their resources are limited. So when they participate, SMEs participate in knowledge sharing, that knowledge sharing is expensive. So it needs to be invested in properly. So a few things to look at in pulling all of this together. Bringing a good draft to a conversation is a great way to get your SMEs invested in information sharing and information revising. Oh, and the highest leverage version of this process, by the way, and I'm somewhat adamant about this, is that this is a process that, as much as possible, is not happening asynchronously. I think we also tend to want to pass on the work of revision to being sort of an ad hoc basis and having asynchronous communication with SMEs, just based upon their time and availability. I urge you, if this has become a point of friction for you, to consider having more synchronous communication with your SMEs and synchronous review and revision time. That can be a wonderful relationship building technique, not just to get that face-to-face or virtual face-to-face time, but also because you're increasing their investment in documentation by showing them how information sharing transforms into deliverable in front of their eyes, right? They get to invest in that process in a more meaningful way. And I've had a lot of SMEs who I've drugged through asynchronous work and then switched to on-call work or in-room work, and have seen their investment increase simply because they're getting brought into the process itself. Okay, so for everything we've talked about thus far, that relationship building process has been heavily on you as the writer, right? It's been heavily on your hustle and your work and your tracking down. And this last piece, I want to talk more about how do you use those techniques as a part of a holistic process that this relationship building and this collaboration can sit on top of. So the last thing I want to talk about is moving from bottlenecks to flow. So when I say bottlenecks, here's what I mean. You have a backlog of tasks, or you have some tasking process. You have work in front of you. You have documentation that needs to get completed, and it may need to get completed in just a variety of different ways, right? And a variety of different asks may be coming to you from different sources. That is sort of the bottleneck in the sense that you're having all of these tasks coming at you, and then you have to find the ways to work with the SMEs to resolve that ask. That is the root issue when it comes to moving into how do you work and do this continuously. When collaboration is a matter of chance and ad hoc, again, every document becomes an emergency. If you don't have a cadence that's expected for contribution, you have to drive that cadence every single time. Again, cold starting your relationship every single time. That is what I mean when I kind of get into this next section. It's not just about being sort of sluggish or expecting your expert to be sluggish. It's about a system that's being left to chance rather than integrating into systems that already exist that can support you in going through a collaborative process again and again and again. And that's the fundamental pivot, right? We got to stop treating getting expert knowledge like a resource that we sort of periodically extract from, and start designing the way that we do information sharing directly into the architecture of the work of the organization. The goal is that you anchor your documentation need and your information sharing into a product lifecycle or a development lifecycle or an operations lifecycle that's already in motion. So if we look at software documentation as an example, because that's the big one, right? The research for documentation doesn't start when the feature is done or the ask comes in, right? It starts way upstream at the bedding table where the team or the product team is still deciding what's worth building. If I, as the writer, am the informed party at a betting table, I know what's coming my way before the feature already exists. The clarification, getting clarity on documentation that's in front of you, doesn't happen through emails being chased or Slack messages being chased 3 weeks later. It happens in the internal demos that you, the writer, are sitting in to get a sense for what's coming your way while the SME is already explaining by necessity what information you need as a part of their own process, right? And the review can happen also as a matter of a release cadence, as a deliverable that needs to be done when you are building out your release cycle and shipping the product, rather than a separate track you have to drag your SME into. If you build in documentation as a necessary step to a release, and you try to funnel that information gathering into meetings and into cadences that already exist, you're reducing, once again, the cognitive load on the SME. Another shift, readdressing that elephant in the room that is AI, that I think is important to track as a part of this integration, is that the use of agentic AI is already doing some of the heavy lifting for you, in the sense that a lot of teams are integrating workflows into their own processes that necessitate capturing tacit knowledge that used to previously only exist as like cultural knowledge, right? Or lives exclusively in the head of the SME. That's unwritten context and rules and process and procedure that's being captured as a part of an agentic workflow that you yourself can leverage. It's going to get captured whether you're in the room or not. So finding those sources of information can be really beneficial both to you and to your SME. The value that you bring is in realizing where that information sharing and information gathering is happening as a part of existing engineering or product life cycles or even support life cycles, and pulling from that information in a way that's sustainable and repeatable. Spend time with your SMEs to uncover where that is already happening so that you are not chasing it down. And that's where the chasing stops, by the way. It's where you build collaboration with your SMEs into processes that already exist in an organization that carry through the work that you need to do to complete the task in front of you. The relationship that you're building has to have somewhere to live, and it has to be repeatable and supported by an organization and the way an organization works already. Finding those processes, becoming an informed party into those conversations is going to be crucial to sustaining relationships with me. All right, so we put all these three things back together. What's the picture that we see? Establishing partnerships reframes the dynamic from transactional to real, actual relationship building. It gives your SME a stake in the outcome of documentation and gives you, the writer, the authority to manage that project and be the user advocate. Moving to guided contribution transforms the interaction and gives the SME the opportunity to give you high quality answers at a lower cost. And then designing that flow within a system, building collaboration directly where information sharing is already happening, means that you are no longer participating in all of the constant SME chasing. You can gather information as a part of existing processes. Now, if we circle back to my API project, because that's what I considered as I started thinking through this talk, I had all of these problems in one sitting in front of me. No relationship, vague asks, no process underpinning it, everything working against me to building actual relationships. All of this happening really early in my career. Easy to work with was my symptom, and it was not a compliment. The other thing too I want to stress here is that when I pivoted sort of to realizing how crucial building relationships with SMEs was, I did it sort of first on the premise that having better working relationships with SMEs was the way to build better documentation. I still fundamentally believe that, and I see that playing out again and again. I didn't realize, and I have realized later on in my career, is that it's also a way to demonstrate the fundamentally crucial thing that being a technical writer is to an organization, right? I didn't realize that seeing myself as a technical writer as someone who's building pipelines of information and partnerships and relationships with SMEs was another way to elevate technical documentation as a crucial part of an organization in such a way that people who weren't just SMEs and weren't just stakeholders, but in leadership could see documentation becoming more visible. When you enter discussions and you have concrete ticket data, customer names, pain points, when you're the person in a room that can articulate what an end user needs out of documentation, it stops being just this sort of tedious post-release obligation or continuous release obligation. It becomes a driver of success, right? And that impact is felt org-wide. This is becoming more crucial in our industry, in my opinion, as we use generative tools more freely. The resources that we need to demonstrate are our abilities to advocate for documentation, for accuracy, for truth, for usability, for quality, to be the user advocate when we are working with other parts of the organization. And writers who lead partnerships with SMEs to create that sense of advocacy and to build those pipelines of information will demonstrate that value, I believe, more effectively. I'm not suggesting all of these things be implemented right away. Building partnerships and relationships takes time. I understand that. But I believe that these are some techniques that you can take away to create better partnerships with those SMEs with whom you already interface every single day, and ways that you can sort of tackle and facilitate those relationships more meaningfully. And finally, just to hammer the point home, remember, as a technical writer, it's not about being easy to work with, it's about being effective to work with and building partnerships that get to better documentation. And those, being easy to work with and being effective, those are two different things.
Thank you, Annie. And that's a wrap for today's session. Thanks a lot to you for walking us through the topic. And of course, if you have more questions or want to learn more about Document 360, then feel free to reach out to us. We'll be back soon with another session. Until then, see you next time. Thank you, Annie, and thank you everyone for joining.